Welcome to all of our panelists. And so this panel really is going to be trying to talk about what is the future of theoretical or computational neuroscience. I think really in particular, what is the future of computation and theory in neuroscience as a broader field. And I guess what's usually happens at the beginning of these panels is just for each person to go along. Well, perhaps we'll start with Wolfgang, and just to briefly introduce themselves, very short sentence, and just a very short sentence on yourself.
I actually come from mathematics and worked for a while also then in theoretical computer science, which works with quite similar method. It's very mathematically oriented. And when I came then into computational neuroscience or theoretical neuroscience, I was really surprised because one reads always in natural science, like in physics, theoreticians care a lot about experimental data. And a lot of the major progress in physics apparently was achieved by theoreticians who realized that experiments really fundamentally contradicted their theoretical predictions. And I thought this would work in the same way in computational neuroscience. But it doesn't work this way then. I think for almost every kind of favorite basic assumption of theoretical neuroscientists, you find experimental data that contradict them. And nobody notices, apparently. I think most theoreticians read mainly papers by other theoreticians. Very few read papers by experimentalists. And this is actually, one has to admit also, it's, I think, non-trivial to really decode experimental work because there are always debates around them, right? So it's not so unique then. But I think it's really necessary nowadays that all theoreticians get grounded in understanding experimental data. And I think we should also have meetings actually where theoreticians are brought together with experimentalists who produce explicitly data that contradict their basic assumptions. And just to toss in some words, I think this applies, for example, to our favorite rules for synaptic plasticity that we apply in theory. If you talk to experts for synaptic plasticity and experimentalists, they don't believe so much in SCDP anymore, or HEP or so. It's the same for dopamine as being the prediction error. This is problematic. But also one sees, if one now looks at the dynamics of database cortical microcircuit models, it's very different from our favorite randomly connected recurrent neural networks. So almost all our favorite toys as theoreticians are becoming questionables. And I think a lot of scientific progress can be achieved by simply facing this dilemma.
You've kindly raised some good points there already about the sort of division between experimentalists and theorists, and being that Athena is next in line, what do you think about that? And I guess you have a lab which has both people in there, and how do you think about managing that?
So it seems you do hear me. Okay. That's right. So I did my PhD in computational neuroscience, and during that time I was not collecting any data, but I was still kind of trying to have a look on actual data electrophysiology from monkey experiments. But then kind of, as I started my postdoc, and later on, I realized that I really would like to do both and have a basically kind of always start thinking about behavior from a specific theoretical perspective and go along in a kind of a loop. I still believe that's the right thing to do, but it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. And the challenge, the biggest challenge that I think computational neuroscience or theoretical neuroscience should seriously think about is how to cross the gap between different scales of behavior and different scales of neural data that we are collecting. On one hand, we have behaviors that are different tasks, different processes. They might have working memory, they might have episodic memory, they might have cognitive control, they might have various type of kind of behavior, and we do have niche models explaining each of those single behaviors, but we lack a kind of a big picture model that can kind of explain behavior across different domains, across different contexts, across different conditions. So we need those type of models. And at the same time, for kind of a neural, more mechanistic models, we do have models that work beautifully in hippocampus or beautifully in striatum. Do they scale in the other brain areas? We don't know. So it's just like, I think we have to have an eye about how to be able to produce more general and generalizable theories that are at the same time falsifiable, of course.
Okay, well, fortunately, the next person in line is the best person to answer that. Well, not the best, sorry. No, sorry. It's a good person to answer that, sorry. Yeah, how do we do that?
Yes, so nice to address both what Wolfgang and Athena said. So Wolfgang, you're quite right that many of the simple theories and models that people have been nicely invalidated by experimental data. However, there's also a lot of experimental data in favor of many of the theories too. So experimental data, because we're dealing with an incredibly complicated system, and that's really relates what Athena is doing. We can't expect a small number of equations to capture a system as complicated as the brain, and behaviors as complicated as the behaviors that we're doing. And as we get essentially, as we get these theories and models, they become almost like filters through which you then say, well, now, given this model, we can now use that to try and essentially the process of falsifying it is the process of designing targeted experiments that show in these circumstances they don't work in the way that they would do. And so to try and build the integrative models that Athena's talking about, then we're pushing these systems beyond where they're essentially originally designed for, and then that raises lots of important questions about how the system should work. And we're dealing with an evolved system, right? Physics is incredibly simple, like small little particles doing not very much, whereas, roughly speaking, whereas animals have to exist in this nasty brutish world. They have to survive correctly in these worlds, which is extremely tough. They're solving, they're effectively solving partially observable problems in cases where it actually matters for their survival. And so to be able to do that, you can't expect it. We can't expect it to be very simple. So that's the task that we set ourselves, is to try and take this complexity and really make it concrete in terms of how it works. So I think that's the excitement, is to say, how can we use our capacity to build simple theories to then say, now to push them and make them more complicated, and then to link, I think we saw lovely in Mackenzie's talk, right? This link between hypothesis-driven and data-driven modeling, I think is really something which is really absolutely critical.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, next up, Rafal, I guess. Oh.
Hello, can you hear me? No, okay, so I will be using microphone. So Wolfgang mentioned that most of the theories have been falsified or are controversial, but I think that there is one example in computational neuroscience of a theory which actually is consistently accepted by most of us, which is the Hodgkin-Huxley model. So kind of the model of individual neuron, and this is probably the only Nobel Prize in computational neuroscience so far. Hopefully it will change soon. And one would think that the reason why this theory is accepted is that neurons are small, and it's easier to build theories for small objects, and it's more difficult to build theories for complex network because there's complexity from interacting elements. But I think that it's perhaps therefore surprising that we do not have analogous consensus for even smaller component of the brain, which is the synapse. Yes? So we don't have a consensus in synaptic plasticity, which is even smaller component, equivalent to the kind of Hodgkin-Huxley equations for neural activity. And I think that the reasons why we do not have it is connected with what Athena mentioned, that synaptic plasticity, although it's connected with a small synapse, the plasticity affects the whole network. So that kind of models of learning which will solve the problem, solve the kind of problems of the organism are the ones which are able to basically work not only on the scale of the synapses, but on the scale of the network. So I think that a really interesting question for the future is how the intelligence emerges from simple interacting elements of the brain. And I think that answering the question of plasticity and providing some kind of equivalent of Hodgkin-Huxley model equations for plasticity would be a really interesting outcome, in my opinion.
Well, I guess broadly, to think about what role of theory has in neuroscience, next steps, what would be real progress for us in neuroscience? What would we have to do to say that we've made progress?
I mean, I think we've seen lots of examples of progress already. Sometimes progress is small, and sometimes it looks like it's one step forward and two steps back in other ways. But I mean, I agree with a lot of everything that's been said. I think it's a matter of connecting across scales. It's about embracing the complexity to some degree. I think that would look really nice. I mean, there's beautiful work from, say, Ian Cousins' group at the MPI in Constance thinking about collective behavior, and there's people working on inductive biases in systems. So while I agree, like synaptic level, Hodgkin-Huxley, I'm there with you, I think we ultimately want to also go like across scales so we can start to connect these mechanistic models to causal understanding. I think that would be super exciting.
Okay. And to Nicolas?
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, so lots of very interesting points have been raised. I just want to come back to a few of them. So the first point that was raised by Wolfgang, he was a little bit pessimistic about these interactions between experimentalists and theorists. And I think a related question is how models capture data at different scales. So you mentioned the Hodgkin-Huxley model, which is a great example always. But I think there's been a lot of progress, in my view, in recent years about this dialogue between experimentalists and theorists. And actually, there have been really very nice success stories, also at the larger scale. In particular, one example that comes to mind is the central complex in the fly that represents head-in direction. And it's a beautiful example of a network that's encoding head direction in flies. And basically, this model behaves exactly as the classic ring model that was proposed many years before. And all the experiments, in particular perturbation experiments that have been done on that system, have proved to be entirely consistent with that theoretical model. So I think it's a nice example of a model at a larger scale that actually is very, has been very successful. And also it speaks also to these notions of universality. There was a very nice talk this morning about universality. It's also a model that actually can apply to many different systems that encode completely different variables. I mean, angular variables, but different types of angular variables. I think also, I just want to come back also to another point that you raised, Wolfgang, about sometimes theorists kind of focusing on a narrow corner. So you mentioned STDP and the issue of synaptic plasticity model. And I would tend to agree with that there's been way too much focus on a very specific aspect of these plasticity rules. And yeah, I think this is one of the goals, I think, of current goals of computational neuroscience, to really understand better models for plasticity and to build Hodgkin-Huxley type models for synapses. Yeah, I entirely agree with that.
Okay, I realize I didn't give these guys the primer and that you're meant to be sort of spicy and adversarial and not so nice to each other. Okay.
I can be adversarial.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can throw a little spice in here. So I think one of the challenges is that, so my lab also does experiments. And I think one of the challenges that I've also seen is I've tried to do what we call theory-guided experiments. So take big theories in the field, like optimal feedback control, design behaviors that allow us to test that. But some of these theories aren't really falsifiable, and they don't make concrete predictions. So I think for a lot of experimentalists, what they want to hear is to say, here's a theory, and I have very concrete predictions about what this system might be doing. And that is a very good way where we can start to build and bridge these gaps between experimentalists and computationalists. But, I'm sitting amongst theoreticians, a little bit of an interloper here.
I might pass that straight over. So I guess Rafal here is the purest theory of theorists here. And so what's your response to, making sure the work you do is falsifiable and so on? Yeah.
Yes, I think that it's easier to make predictions. Okay, so the type of models where the predictions are quite easy to falsify or validate are the kind of models which not even necessarily describe computations in the neural system by dynamics. So, for example, in your talk today, this was an example of a model which, doesn't describe so much the computation, but just kind of dynamics. And I think that these kind of models are also quite successful, even for the larger scales. And I spent a lot of time in my life making predictions and suggesting the experiments to my colleagues, and my colleagues ran several experiments I suggested, but the ones which actually came out most consistent with the predictions of the model were the experiments based on this kind of models of the dynamics, not so much than the computation, because I think the dynamics is easier to predict. So this is another very fruitful direction in which the theory can make predictions.
So theories have their own version of the all theories are wrong, but some theories are useful, right? Exactly. And so the question is, what do you want a theory for, right? So something like optimal feedback control, indeed, it's a much too general principle. On the other hand, that general principle generates a huge number of experiments, which then actually refine a whole set of questions which come along with those. And so I think that we shouldn't criticize the theories. We shouldn't necessarily say that we want a notion of falsifiability which is directly applied to the theory, because the theory is really is a huge hypothesis generation engine as well, essentially. And I think that I think you can see that in beautiful ways in various theoretical approaches that have been there. But obviously falsifiability is really critical for as you make theories more concrete, and then at some point you have to say, well, maybe we've had to go so far beyond what our sort of theoretical assumptions we're making, our sort of Marian level, computational level, that ceases being useful as a hypothesis generation engine, and then we have to go and do something else instead. But I think we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
I fully agree.
Maybe from an experimentalist that we. Oh, sorry, to pigeonhole you. But.
Go ahead.
I would like to come back also to one challenge now of Urit. Now, when he opened the meeting on Tuesday, he suggested that we may still be in an ancient, historic time of computational neuroscience, where we haven't even understood what are the really important basic concepts. And I think now one should use this as an incentive to really think radically also about different approaches. I think particularly for young scientists, I think they should use their creativity and their capability to criticize existing approaches to really have new ideas. I think I see too much premature convergence onto a few ideas then, and I see also a lot of convergence onto concepts really which are known from artificial neural networks, right? So often it's hard to avoid to fill this void of really concrete biological data without really putting in there what we have in our mind, how we think it should work then, right? And I think this is one of the big dangers. I think one really should take into account neural circuits and brain architectures are to major extent still unknown then, right? And we should discover how they really work and not try to make them work by like artificial neural networks. And you see this even in experimental neuroscientists, right? Often they set up experiments like a stimulus and then a delay and then something in order to make this brain, after weeks of training, work like a theoretical computer science model or so, right? I think one should really, I like very much also the approach like now we just seen from Mathis, also really take the inherent dynamics and properties of neural circuits seriously, and also like very much, for example, that she brought in behavior. This is, for example, something where all biologists argue it's really important to understand that every animals, and we also are at any moment in time, within some behavior, and this behavior colors our sensory perception, our kind of likely things to do, and many things, whereas this is completely abstracted out in almost all models then. And we deliberately, often experimentalists, put animals in a particular behavior, like food deprived or water deprived, right? And then you lock them into behavior. But I do not think that we understand brains in this reductionist way. Then we have to bring in the full spectrum of capabilities of brains then. So therefore, as one answer to this proposition of Urit, I would suggest that the concept of a behavior of an animal should be taken as a kind of important concept then, and which has been ignored so far.
I also would like to add another component, which is I think experimentalists and computationalist theoreticians, all of us, we should seriously think about is just like which type of understanding we are aiming to achieve, right? It's just like, and that's extremely hard. And I think it just like needs to be revised constantly, right? Because what is happening most of the time is just like we apply some fancy methods on our data, we observe something interesting and cool in our either behavior or the neural dynamics, and then we stop there. And then we just like, we feel like, okay, so we now know something about the brain, but is that it? Like, so, and to tell the truth, I mean, it's kind of difficult to even just like kind of maybe formulate it, what that understanding looks like before having it, right? I actually don't know whether like physicists, before having a standard model of the universe, they knew what they want and they kind of thought about it, or Einstein knew that like what general relativity would look like and then think about it. I don't know how that thought process went for physicists, but like for us, I think it's really on us. I don't know, maybe some workshops need to be really dedicated about just like to discuss and brainstorm what do we mean by understanding the brain and which type of theories would satisfy us, and then think about that, and then it would come in kind of stages of like we collect data, we definitely need powerful tools like Zyphra to make sense of that data, but then we need some theoretical framework to put that kind of a formalized, minimal kind of understanding of the data in that framework in order to achieve some understanding. But without that kind of a big picture of what do we mean by understanding, it will be a very kind of a difficult challenge to make progress.
Okay. Well, being that we're at the Mathematics of Neuroscience and AI, I think we'd be remiss to wonder about the question of what role do computational theoretical neuroscience have in the progression of AI. I think once upon a time it was thought it was essential, but maybe not so much. It'd be great if there were some proponents and some defeatists amongst you to communicate.
I'll be on the defeatist side. So I think it used to be, and we had there was a very interesting meeting in Lake Tissy, which a number of people actually, I think in this audience were there as well. So it used to be that computational neuroscience could sort of justify itself and part of its funding by saying, we need to have approaches to computational understanding of intelligence, and we didn't have very many of them, and so the computational neuroscience looked like perhaps it was one of them. Now that AI, has developed structures which are at least capable of doing some of the things we want from intelligent systems themselves, now computational neuroscience can now revert to being a normal natural science. So of course that means less funding, so less nice trips to Roman embassies. But it's good for the science in the sense that we no longer necessarily quite so umbilically tied. So instead we can use, obviously we can, as ever, we want to use tools that come from many different places. The tools that come from AI are fantastic because they can give us ideas about how systems of different sorts can actually do the sorts of computations we're interested in, but they're not the whole story. And I think I'm looking forward to the sort of the natural science coming back.
So with the current progress of AI, I worry that the brain will not be understood by us humans, but by AI of the future. Yes. Why would it bother? Because the funding agency will ask it to do. Peter asked why would it bother? Yes. Okay. So to answer also the question, or try to put a voice to the question which Athena posed, what is the form of the theories we want? I would like to cite my colleague Peter Latham from UCL, who once said to me that, in the past, I wanted to build the kind of computational models of complicated cognitive functions, but then I realized that the brain is so complicated that we'll never understand how it really works. The only interesting question is how it learns, how it is able to kind of organize itself to fulfill these functions. Yeah, so this is Peter Latham's answer to your question, I think.
No more?
I agree with Peter. I mean, I think also for the future of computational neuroscience, I think we need to be careful that we don't just merge and become machine learning researchers, spoken from someone who just used fancy machine learning tools to understand the brain. I do think we actually really need good theory, and I really like Athena's point about a standard model, like what would that look like? And it might be across scales, and it might not be one like in physics, but many, and how are we going to tie these together? I really think we need theory. So in that notion, I also think we need good data that's theory driven, and so we're trying to establish a sort of group about building a brain observatory that would allow theoreticians to specifically test hypotheses in the circuits across many different tasks in mice, and do this in a very concrete way that maybe gets us to these models. But I definitely think we want to make sure that comp neuro stays comp neuro and doesn't just merge into something like neuro AI and machine learning. And yeah, that's maybe a hot take, sorry. But, yeah.
Any other thoughts? Yeah, okay, yep. Sure. Well, I can ask, a question from anyone?
Yeah, answers.
Well, starting from, like, in the US, we organize a workshop, Brain Initiative, NSF-sponsored workshop on future frameworks on theoretical neuroscience a few years back, and we published a paper already on that. So I think it would be a great thing to repeat that. Yeah. And actually, with my colleague, we were thinking about like organizing neuroscience and AI frameworks. Yeah. Anyway, but one thing about, I have an issue with what Rafal said. A model is not a theory, right? And even in the review paper, in the final paper in the Hodgkin and Huxley, they said, we use this set of equations just because they fit the data, right? And actually, we use the simpler Hodgkin and Huxley model, the n to the fourth, because they just didn't have the computer power to calculate the n to the sixth. Because nobody reads, right? Then we keep using the n to the fourth model, right? And in terms of like synaptic plasticity, I think people read only the chapter in Hepp's book that he kind of thinks about synaptic plasticity. But that book was about behavior. And it was way more important what he was doing with respect of enriched environments. That tells us more what you were saying. We're simplifying the environment and say that that's behavior. And Hebb, in his book, said, no, look, what creates kind of intelligence is enhanced environments, right? But we don't do that, right? So I will challenge a little bit of what has been said so far.
So Peter, in his book on theoretical neuroscience, at the first page, you have this nice classification of theories in neuroscience into descriptive, algorithmic, and descriptive, mechanistic, and interpretative. And I think that the Hodgkin-Huxley model, I think is you give it as an example of descriptive model, but I think that it has also a normative basis. So I think there's beautiful work from Sophie Deneuve, which basically shows how you can end up with integrate and fire model from first principles, from kind of like good encoding of the input. So this is the paper by Berlin et al. And I think that neuron is sufficiently simple that Hodgkin and Huxley were lucky that they were able to identify good description, good model without the actually normative understanding. And I think synapse, although it's smaller, probably is more, in a sense, complex, that we need not only the descriptive understanding, but we need to have a meeting of bottom-up approaches from the data, from kind of, integrating a lot of data which has been observed, and top-down from the theory of learning.
I think maybe Nicolas has something to say to that, because I guess some of the work you presented would have, well, go ahead.
This works. Can you hear me?
No.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, comparing, I think it's an interesting comparison between Hodgkin-Huxley and models of synapses, and I think it relates also to a question that Athena were raising about the issue of different scales, and in this case, temporal scales, because, so I think Hodgkin-Huxley works well, it's because it's at a fast time scale that is easy to probe experimentally, but we know that there are also much slower processes at work in neurons that are not described at all by Hodgkin-Huxley model. I think the problem with synapses is that there are many timescales that are at work. In fact, we have pretty good models of synapses at short timescales also. We have pretty good descriptions of synaptic noise, of short-term synaptic plasticity. But what's really complicated in synapses is more these interactions between many different scales that lead to long-term plasticity, for instance, and that's much harder to study both experimentally and to capture in computational models.
So you talk, but I guess I'm interested in how those models might meet some theoretical underpinning, like the meeting of these two things, from a normative theory to a model. And what do you think about that, or where that lies in your work?
Sorry, I didn't get your question. What's the link with normative theories?
Rafal was talking about that it's nice not just to have some sort of model, but you really want some underlying principles that would give birth to that model. And do we need that? Do we need there to be some normative theory behind every model, or what level of abstraction can we be happy with?
Well, I'm not sure we need it. Of course, it's nicer if there is a normative explanation. And I think in some synaptic plasticity models do have some normative explanation. I'm thinking, for example, of reinforced learning rules, where basically the idea is, in some cases, you can prove that they can lead to a stochastic gradient ascent of future rewards. Or in the unsupervised case, OER rules and similar rules that can also maximize, in some cases, mutual information. So, there is no unified model, I guess, as for the Hodgkin-Huxley model, but which also does not work. I mean, what's powerful with Hodgkin-Huxley is that the formalism that they used could be generalized to other types of currents and cell types, but also it's certainly not a unified model.
Test. Okay, I think. Yeah, since you mentioned the Hodgkin-Huxley model, I can't resist the temptation to continue playing devil's advocate. If you look at, say, the cell database from the Allen Institute that is on the web, where they have recorded hundreds of neurons from rodents and humans, they always inject a step current into each of them, and they recorded the spiking pattern. Maybe a few % of these hundreds of neurons kind of respond in the way how the Hodgkin-Huxley model would predict then, right? And this is now with current injection into the soma. If you go a step further, there are dendrites, right? In particular, for example, for synaptic plasticity, one knows then that processes within the particular apical dendrites, like dendritic spikes. Now, Christine Greenberger mentioned these plateau potentials are really important now, right? So I think even the neural model is at the moment a shaky basis then for theoreticians then.
Okay.
Well, no, it's more specific than that, no, I think.
Okay, I feel like it was just going to start becoming adversarial and fighty, but alas, we have to stop now. But I'm sure everyone here would be very happy to go outside in the beautiful grounds and continue to argue. So
pistols at dawn?
Huh?
Pistols at dawn?
Pistols at dawn, absolutely. Yeah, but first Rory will say something.
So thank the panelists.
Yeah. Thank you, panel.
That was good. That was good. Good lesson. Would you mind taking that up there?